November 30th, 1942. Just past midnight in the waters off Tassafaronga, Guadalcanal. The ocean is black glass under a moonless sky. 8 Japanese destroyers cut through the darkness in column formation, their hulls slicing the water with barely a whisper. No lights, no radio chatter. Only the muted thrum of engines and the soft hiss of displaced water. On the bridge of the lead destroyer, Naganami, Commander Sato Torajiro peers into the void ahead, his night-adapted eyes scanning for any sign of the enemy. Behind his ship, 7 more destroyers follow in perfect, disciplined line, their decks stacked with drums of rice, ammunition, and medical supplies lashed to the railings, the famed Tokyo Express run that has kept Japanese forces on Guadalcanal alive for months. They are the lifeline, the shadow convoy that moves only in darkness, departing before dawn can expose them to American air power. Tonight, they expect nothing more than another successful supply delivery, another night of American impotence, another small victory in a grinding campaign of attrition. They do not see the American cruisers waiting ahead in the darkness. Not yet. In the blackness 3 miles north, 5 American heavy cruisers and 4 destroyers lie in ambush, their crews at battle stations, their radar screens painting green phosphorescent pictures of targets the human eye cannot yet perceive. Aboard the cruiser Minneapolis, sailors stand beside torpedo tubes loaded and trained, their hands resting on firing mechanisms, waiting for the order that will come any second now. The Americans have numerical advantage, 9 warships against 8. They have radar, that miraculous technology that turns night into day, invisibility into targeting data. They have position, having detected the Japanese column early and maneuvered across its path. Everything favors them, every tactical calculation, every advantage of modern warfare belongs to the United States Navy this night. And yet, within 30 minutes, 4 of those American cruisers will be crippled or sinking, their bows blown off, their hulls flooding, their crews dying in oil-slicked water. The Japanese, outnumbered and outgunned, will emerge nearly unscathed. The torpedo, that simple, terrible weapon, will make the difference. To understand what happened at Tassafaronga, one must first understand the weapon itself and the doctrine built around it. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo, known to American sailors by the chilling designation Long Lance, was the most advanced torpedo in the world in 1942. It measured 24 feet in length, weighed nearly 2 tons, and carried a warhead of 1,080 pounds of high explosive, more than twice the punch of its American equivalent. But size was not its greatest advantage. The Long Lance was powered by pure oxygen rather than compressed air, which meant it left almost no visible wake, no telltale trail of bubbles that might warn a target of its approach. It traveled at 49 knots for 22 miles, or 36 knots for an astonishing 40 miles, ranges that dwarfed anything in the American arsenal. An American destroyer captain could fire his torpedoes at maximum range and hope to hit a target 6 miles away. A Japanese destroyer captain could fire from 20 miles out and expect his weapons to arrive with lethal accuracy. More than the weapon itself, it was the doctrine surrounding it that made Japanese destroyers so deadly. American naval strategy treated destroyers as escorts, screening units, whose primary job was to protect larger ships from submarines and aircraft. Japanese naval doctrine saw destroyers as offensive weapons in their own right. Fast, maneuverable torpedo platforms designed to close with enemy lines under cover of darkness and deliver devastating surprise attacks. Japanese destroyer crews drilled endlessly in night combat, learning to operate without lights, to navigate by stars and instinct, to coordinate attacks through visual signals rather than radio. They trained to fire torpedoes not in desperation, but as a first strike weapon, launching spreads of deadly fish long before guns came into range. By late 1942, American naval officers were beginning to understand this philosophy, but understanding and countering it were two different things. Reports filtered back from survivors of earlier battles, Savo Island, Cape Esperance, describing torpedoes appearing from nowhere, striking without warning, devastating ships that never saw their attackers. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Japanese ships would maneuver close under cover of darkness, launch torpedoes en masse, then withdraw before American guns could find them. The long lance had become the equalizer, the weapon that allowed numerically inferior Japanese forces to savage American task forces that should have dominated through sheer weight of metal. Tassafaronga would prove the pattern once more. At 11:16 p.m., American radar detected the approaching Japanese column. Rear Admiral Carleton Wright, commanding from the cruiser Minneapolis, ordered his ships into attack formation. The plan was textbook: use radar to close to torpedo range, launch a coordinated strike, then open up with guns while the enemy reeled from the blow. The Americans had 8 destroyers in position to make the initial torpedo attack, their weapons ready, their crews eager. This was the moment radar was supposed to deliver: perfect situational awareness, decisive advantage, the ability to strike first from the darkness. But Admiral Wright hesitated. He wanted visual confirmation. He wanted to be certain. The radar returns were clear, but radar was still new, still distrusted by officers trained in the old ways of visual sighting and gut instinct. Precious minutes slipped away while Wright waited for his lookouts to confirm what his machines had already told him. By the time he gave the order to launch torpedoes, the range had opened. The American destroyers fired 20 torpedoes at extreme range into the darkness, hoping for hits on targets they could barely see. Every single American torpedo missed. The Japanese, unaware they had been targeted, continued their approach. Then, at 11:21 p.m., American cruisers opened fire. 6-inch and 8-inch guns erupted in thunderous salvos, their muzzle flashes lighting the night like strobe lights. Shells screamed across the water and found the Japanese destroyer Takanami, the tail-end ship in the enemy column. She was hit repeatedly, her superstructure shredded, fires erupting across her deck. Within minutes, she was dead in the water, burning and doomed. The Americans believed they had achieved surprise. They had not. The moment the first American guns fired, Japanese destroyer captains reacted with drilled precision. They had trained for this. Without waiting for orders, without hesitation, they swung their ships to launch bearings and fired torpedoes, not at random, but in carefully calculated spreads designed to bracket the gun flashes lighting up the American position. 44 Type 93 torpedoes entered the water, their oxygen engines leaving no trace, their warheads armed and deadly, racing toward targets outlined by their own gunfire. The Americans did not know they were coming. Radar could detect ships. It could not detect torpedoes in the water. There was no warning, no alarm, no moment of realization before the weapons found their marks. At 11:27 p.m., 6 minutes after the Americans opened fire, the first long lance struck the cruiser Minneapolis forward, just ahead of the No. 1 turret. The explosion was catastrophic. The bow disintegrated, severed cleanly as if cut by a guillotine, 40 feet of forward hull peeling away and sinking immediately.
The ship lurched, slowed, began taking on water by the thousands of tons. Men were killed instantly by the blast, crushed by collapsing bulkheads, drowned in flooding compartments that became tombs in seconds.
2 minutes later, New Orleans, sailing directly behind Minneapolis, was hit in almost the identical location. Her bow tore away, 150 feet of it, the entire forward section twisting and breaking off, dragging down men and machinery into the black depths. The ship staggered, her engine still driving her forward, even as her severed bow acted like an anchor, pulling her in circles. Then Pensacola was hit, the torpedo striking amidships, detonating fuel tanks, igniting fires that would rage for hours. Then Northampton, the last cruiser in line, took a spread of 2 torpedoes on her port side. Massive explosions ripped through her engineering spaces, killing power, flooding boiler rooms, dooming her to a slow death. She would sink before dawn, the only American ship lost outright that night, but the others were scarcely better off, crippled, flooding, their crews fighting desperately to save vessels that might never fight again. Within 10 minutes, the American task force had been shattered. They had expected dominance. They had expected radar and superior numbers to deliver the kind of one-sided victory the U.S. Navy had been promised since the dark days of 1942 began to lift. Instead, they found themselves bleeding in the darkness, their ships crippled by an enemy they had outnumbered and outgunned, defeated by a weapon they could not detect and a doctrine they had not fully understood. Japanese destroyers, their torpedo tubes empty, their mission accomplished, withdrew into the night at high speed. They left behind the burning wreck of Takanami, but they took with them a victory as complete as it was stunning. 8 destroyers had engaged 9 American warships and crippled 4 heavy cruisers, a third of the enemy force, while suffering only a single loss. The Tokyo Express had not merely survived, it had won. American survivors, clinging to wreckage or fighting fires aboard gutted ships, struggled to comprehend what had happened. They had done everything right. They had detected the enemy first, they had maneuvered into position, they had opened fire and scored hits, and yet they had lost, decisively, brutally, in a matter of minutes. Sailors who had believed American technology and industrial power would inevitably prevail now understood that war at sea remained viciously unforgiving, that a single weapon skillfully employed could erase every advantage, that the enemy they faced was not beaten, not demoralized, not ready to surrender. Admiral Wright's after-action report, filed days later, was a study in bureaucratic restraint, barely concealing shock. He noted the effectiveness of enemy torpedoes. He noted the apparent superiority of Japanese night-fighting doctrine. He noted that American torpedo performance had been, in his words, disappointing. The report did not capture the rage and frustration of his crews, the sailors who had watched their ships torn apart by invisible weapons, the damage control parties who had struggled for hours to save vessels that should never have been hit in the first place. But the lesson was learned, even if the learning came soaked in blood and seawater. There is a detail, small and terrible, preserved in the damage reports from Minneapolis and New Orleans. When the long-lance torpedoes struck, severing the bows of both cruisers, the ships did not immediately sink. Their watertight compartments held, their crews fought the flooding, their captains nursed them backward toward Tulagi Harbor at agonizing 3-knot speeds, their missing bows leaving them wallowing like wounded whales. It took hours. The journey should have been impossible, but American damage control, the training, the equipment, the obsessive redundancy built into every system kept them afloat. Ships that should have gone down in minutes survived long enough to be salvaged, repaired, returned to service months later. This, in its own way, was the American answer to the long lance. Not a better torpedo,
though that would come, but the capacity to absorb punishment and endure, the ability to lose a battle and remain in the war, the industrial depth to repair ships that other navies would have scrapped, to rebuild crews that other navies could not replace, to return again and again until sheer persistence overwhelmed skill and doctrine. But in November 1942, that answer was still being written. At Tassafaronga, the Japanese proved that tactical excellence could trump technological advantage, that a single weapon, perfectly designed and skillfully employed, could decide battles regardless of numbers. The long-lance torpedo, that oxygen-breathing phantom, had once again demonstrated its lethal primacy in the night waters of the Solomons.
Japanese sailors aboard the withdrawing destroyers felt vindication, not triumph. They had won, yes, but they had not delivered the supply drums. The mission had been aborted, the precious cargo jettisoned to allow for high-speed escape. The troops on Guadalcanal would go another night without resupply, another night closer to starvation. The tactical victory at sea meant nothing if the strategic situation on land continued to deteriorate. And it was deteriorating relentlessly as American forces ground forward, supplied by a logistics system that could absorb losses like Tassafaronga and barely notice. This was the paradox the Japanese faced. They could win battles and still lose the war. They could demonstrate superior night-fighting tactics, superior torpedo technology, superior seamanship, and it would not matter because the Americans would return with more ships, more planes, more men, more of everything. The long lance was a magnificent weapon, but Japan could not manufacture them fast enough to replace losses. Each destroyer sunk was a destroyer that could not be quickly replaced. Each experienced crew killed was a loss that training could not remedy in time. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning. After Tassafaronga, U.S. Navy doctrine changed. Radar operators received better training. Tactics were revised to emphasize immediate action rather than cautious confirmation. Torpedo technology, long neglected, finally received the engineering attention it deserved. The Mark 15 torpedo, plagued with defects and short range, began a slow process of improvement. New destroyers, equipped with better fire control systems and longer-range weapons, began rolling off American shipyards at a rate Japan could not hope to match. By mid-1943, the night battles would begin to shift. American ships, once victims of Japanese torpedo attacks, would start winning through better coordination, better technology, and overwhelming numbers. The long lance would remain deadly, but it would no longer be decisive. The Japanese advantage in night combat would erode, not because they fought poorly, but because the Americans learned, adapted, and brought to bear resources that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. There is a photograph taken in January 1943 of the cruiser Minneapolis in dry dock at Espiritu Santo. The image is startling. Where the bow should be, there is nothing, just a flat, riveted bulkhead, as if the ship were designed to end abruptly 40 feet behind where it should begin. Sailors pose on the truncated deck, their expressions caught between pride and disbelief. Behind them, welders and shipfitters swarm over the hull, fabricating a temporary bow that will allow the ship to limp back to Pearl Harbor for proper repairs. The work will take weeks. The final repair will take months. But the ship will return to service, will fight again, will survive the war. No Japanese cruiser torpedoed at Tassafaronga would have received such treatment. Japanese shipyards were already stretched thin, Japanese resources already strained. A crippled cruiser might be patched enough to reach port, but full repair, restoration to combat effectiveness was a luxury Japan could not afford. Ships were lost not just in battle, but in the slow attrition of irreplaceable damage, unfixable wounds, neglect born of scarcity. This was the hidden calculus of the Pacific War, that battles like Tassafaronga could be tactical defeats for America and strategic victories nonetheless, because America could afford to lose and rebuild, while Japan could not. The Long Lance could cripple 4 cruisers in one night, and those cruisers would return. The destroyers that fired those torpedoes, once lost, would never be replaced in time. The sound of the Long Lance striking home, that low, shuddering boom followed by the shriek of tearing metal, became a recurring nightmare for American sailors who survived Tassafaronga. It was a sound that represented something more than just explosive force. It represented the terror of the invisible, the weapon that gave no warning, that could not be seen or heard until the moment of impact. It was the acoustic symbol of Japanese tactical superiority, the proof that skill and preparation could still matter in an age of radar and radio. But sounds, like advantages, fade. By 1944, the sound that haunted the Pacific was no longer the Long Lance's detonation, but the roar of American carrier aircraft, the thunder of American naval gunfire, the relentless industrial hum of a war machine that could not be stopped, could not be outfought, only could be endured until it crushed everything in its path. The Long Lance remained deadly until the war's end, but it became a relic of a losing strategy. A weapon that won battles that no longer mattered, that sank ships in a navy that had already lost. The rails run through Solomon Islands now, though not for trains. There were never many trains there. But the waters off Tassafaronga, calm and warm under tropical sun, still hide the wreckage of that night. The destroyer Takanami lies on the bottom, her hull broken, her guns silent. The bow section of New Orleans, severed so cleanly it sank almost intact, rests in the deep, a monument to the destructive precision of the Long Lance. Divers who explore these wrecks report an eerie stillness, the sense of violence frozen in place, preserved in coral and rust. The lesson of Tassafaronga is not that the Japanese were invincible at night, though for a time they seemed to be. It is not that the Long Lance was an unstoppable weapon, though it was fearsome. The lesson is that tactical excellence can win battles, but it cannot win wars. That a superior weapon in skilled hands can achieve devastating results, but it cannot overcome the fundamental imbalance of industrial power. That Japan, for all its tactical brilliance, for all its doctrine and discipline and technological innovation, was fighting an enemy that could lose again and again and still return stronger, angrier, more determined. The Americans learned from their defeats. They adapted their tactics, improved their weapons, trained their crews to fight at night with the same ferocity the Japanese had once monopolized. And they brought to bear the one advantage that no amount of skill could counter: abundance. The abundance to build ships faster than they could be sunk, the abundance to train crews faster than they could be killed, the abundance to absorb losses that would have crippled any other nation and emerge from the wreckage not weakened but resolved. Freedom, in the end, was sustained not by ideology alone, but by the capacity to endure, to rebuild, to return. The Long Lance could tear the bow off a cruiser, but it could not tear the resolve from a nation. The torpedo found its mark again and again, and still the Americans came. The night battles of the Solomons are studied now in naval academies, analyzed for their tactical lessons, their doctrinal innovations, their demonstration of how technology and training intersect in combat. Tassafaronga is remembered as a Japanese victory, hard won and brilliantly executed, but it is also remembered as a turning point, the moment that American forces, bloodied and humiliated, began the long process of learning how to fight and win in the darkness. The torpedoes found their mark, and the war continued, relentless and inevitable, until the only sound remaining was silence.